Pablo Picasso has generated perhaps more discussion and more attention than any artist ever. And now Picasso is coming to San Francisco. You can see more than 100 of his masterpieces from the permanent collection at the Musée National Picasso in Paris in a rare exhibition here at the de Young Museum.
He said, everything you can imagine is real. His art proved those weren't just words. Spencer Christian travels in the footsteps of the revolutionary, the pioneer, Picasso, life, work, and legacy.
Welcome to Paris, France, perhaps the world's foremost city of art, beauty, culture, and romance. And Paris was the longtime home of Pablo Picasso, one of the world's most famous and most influential artists. And this is a Musée Picasso, which contains many of the master's works. In the next half hour, we'll take an intimate look at the life and the genius of Picasso.
Picasso's accomplishment as an artist is really extraordinary. By all accounts, he's the most influential artist of the 20th century. He himself invented several new art forms. Cubism, he was a major contributor to Surrealism, but he also really challenged viewers to help complete the work. This is one of his great innovations. He created a whole new vocabulary for art, and ultimately that's his greatest contribution, is to redefine the very nature of art itself.
That statement speaks volumes about Pablo Picasso's place in art history. Consider this. A significant portion of all art from the 20th century could not have existed without Picasso.
Picasso, of all the great artists, is perhaps the most protean in his ability to both invent new styles, but also move on. He was a great adherent of exploration and innovation and discovery. The thing he always resisted was being tied to a single movement or a single group.
Picasso demonstrated exceptional artistic talent even in his early childhood. And he had the good fortune of being born into just the right family to cultivate that talent.
The most important influence for Picasso as an artist was his own father, who was an artist himself. And very interestingly, Picasso tells a story that his talent was so extraordinary. He once said, I could paint like Raphael when I was a child. It's not actually true when we look at those paintings, but he definitely thought he could. And he tells an amazing story where he said his own father gave up art and handed over his brushes and palette to the young boy genius. And even though we now know that story is not true, it suggests the sort of sense of self that Picasso had at a very early age.
Picasso's father was the primary influence on his son's artistic vision, yet their styles could not have been more different.
Picasso's father absolutely worked in a more academic tradition. He painted realistic paintings. He also painted subjects that were works in subjects and themes that Picasso himself liked. His first painting, as Picasso as a young child of 10, was a bullfight. So how appropriate that the Spaniard Picasso should choose the national pastime for his first painting, and as viewers know, that becomes one of his favorite subjects throughout his life.
Picasso was an incredibly worker, always working, always trying to go further, always aware about his own capacity, ability, and this wonderful creativity.
Pablo Picasso's life began in the city of Malaga, Spain. He was the eldest child, born October 25, 1881, to a middle-class family. As a mere teenager, Picasso suffered a tragic loss when his sister, Conchita, died at the age of 7 from diphtheria. It was a traumatic experience, which would leave a lasting mark.
Picasso actually promised God when his sister was ill that if she lived, he would give up art. This is an extraordinary sacrifice on the young artist's part, but in fact she died. He never recovered from it completely, and when he had a child with Marie-Thérèse Walter in the 1930s, he gave her his sister's name.
After his sister's tragic death, Picasso's family moved to Barcelona, where he began to thrive as an artist. At the age of 15, he enrolled in the country's foremost art school, Madrid's Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando.
His mother used to say that every profession he would have chosen, he would have been the best. And he knew, I guess, since he was a little boy, that he had this power.
Picasso could accurately be described as the Shakespeare of the art world, not only because he was so prolific, created so many works. The Musée Picasso alone has 3,600 works by him. But also because, in a way, just as Shakespeare made English a global language, one could argue that in the 20th century, Picasso made his vocabularies Cubism, Surrealism, global languages as well. If you were an artist maturing in the 20th century, you had to learn to speak Picasso. And you had to learn to either embrace him, fight him, reject him, or all the above, but you couldn't ignore him.
In 1900, Picasso made his first trip to Paris, which at that time was the art capital of Europe. During much of the early 20th century, he divided his time between Barcelona and Paris.
He began to be a great painter when he arrived in Paris. And it was not just like in one moment. He had to go and come back, go back, come back, because it was perhaps too much, and he needed time to understand what was the way he could deal with Paris and the way he could deal with other artists and all the museums. I think that it is in Paris that he was able to become Picasso.
And become Picasso he did. During this time, Picasso began to grow and evolve in ways that would have an extraordinary impact on the art world.
And this, Le Bateau Lavoir, is a studio where Picasso painted during the years between 1904 and 1912.
I think Picasso is perhaps most famous for his innovation, along with Georges Braque, his best friend, in Cubism between about 1909 and 1914. The interesting thing is that art historians give Cubism the credit for perhaps the movement that truly made anything possible in art, but it's also true that perhaps it's the toughest movement in Picasso's body of work for viewers to appreciate. It's the subject or the movement we all know to respect, but perhaps find harder to love. Picasso's Cubism really starts as a form of expressionism. This is when he has the African art motifs overtly like the Mass in his work. But then he moves on to what's known as synthetic Cubism, which is much more decorative. But one of the great innovations of this period of Cubism is to actually incorporate real-life objects into the works. So that's one of the great innovations of Cubism. Cubism is an accumulation of moments in time that then create a more true likeness.
Picasso, life, work, and legacy will return. Pablo Picasso's stylistic brilliance made him one of the most celebrated artists of all time. His genius is reflected in the many periods for which he's known. One of the most popular is the Blue Period, from 1901 to 1904, exhibiting a more somber aspect of the artist.
There's no common thread that ties together all of Picasso's great movements and styles. They often derive, it would seem, from very personal motivations. The Blue Period, which is one of the most famous Picasso styles, may have evolved from the death of a very close friend, Carlos Casagemas, his best friend from Barcelona. They share a studio in Paris. They both fall in love with the same woman, and Carlos Casagemas actually shoots and kills himself. He commits suicide in a cafe in front of the woman. Picasso never recovered from this early loss of his friend, and many people feel this is the inspiration for the Blue Period, which, as we would all think, has that connotation of melancholy when you're feeling blue.
But Picasso's artistic expression would continue to evolve, and the somber aspect of the Blue Period would give way to the warmer, more vibrant Rose Period from 1904 to 1906.
The The Rose period is often seen as an inspiration in part from his meeting Ferdinand d'Olivier, the first great love of his life. They move in together in his ramshackle studio in Montmartre, and he begins to have the semblance of a domestic life. And all of a sudden, when that happens, the blue period tonalities start to lighten in this gorgeous sun-drenched roses, pinks, and oranges. And he had just been to a small mountain village of Gossel in the Pyrenees, and perhaps this kind of beautiful red earth tones that you see in the rock formations there is another inspiration.
Another inspiration indeed, as one of Picasso's greatest masterpieces would now emerge from his African-influenced period, 1907 to 1909.
Picasso, like many artists, admired African art for their abstract and decorative qualities and patterns, but unlike every other artist working in Paris at the time, he understood these were sacred objects. That's the term he used. And he said, art is not an aesthetic operation, it's a form of magic.
And Picasso created his own magic in his unique way of abstracting the human form.
You will find great enjoyment and pleasure out of looking at these paintings for the sheer value of their beauty, of their palette, of their line, of their design, of the composition of the canvas. You know, I think that's one of the things that sets Picasso apart.
When Picasso first arrived in Paris in 1900, he immediately immersed himself in the language, he embraced the culture, and ultimately made Paris his home. And in 1937, at this very location, he painted Guernica.
Guernica is one of the greatest political statements in art of all time, so he clearly had strong political leanings.
Picasso remained in Paris during World War II while the Germans occupied the city. He was protected to some extent by his fame and was able to continue painting, but was forbidden from exhibiting. Picasso also was known as a political activist and generated much controversy when he joined the Communist Party.
I think Picasso, having come through the trauma of the crucible of World War II, living in exile from Spain in Paris under the Nazis and the SS who visited his studio regularly and sort of harassed him, felt that in the post-war years, perhaps communism was a format and a party that could lead a way to a more universal kind of brotherhood. And so many of Picasso's closest friends actually broke their friendships with him over his joining the Communist Party.
We'll be back with more Picasso, life, work, and legacy.
We're now in the neighborhood known as Montmartre, where Picasso lived during his early years in Paris. And in this building, au Lapin Agile, he socialized with his fellow artists.
Matisse is the only artist in Picasso's entire life that he actually accorded great respect. Partly, I think it's that Matisse is old enough or older enough to be almost a father figure, and indeed, at the end of his life, Picasso creates paintings where he shows his father as Matisse or vice versa in these sort of portraits. Picasso often said, in the end, there's only Matisse.
Picasso was so important as an artist that the relation he could have with other artists were already spoiled, because people knew that he could change their lives.
And in much the way that Matisse influenced Picasso's vision as an artist, Gertrude Stein enhanced his reputation as an artist.
Gertrude and Leo Stein had a salon where all these artists, writers, musicians, poets would come and gather, exchange ideas and information, and not least for Picasso, he would see these other artists' works. Picasso was famously competitive about his own work and other artists, but when you became a true rival to Picasso, he would run over you in a second, and he said, bad artists copy, great artists steal.
Picasso was married twice and had 4 children by 3 women. He also famously, or perhaps infamously, had numerous mistresses in addition to his wives and primary partners. But despite what might be called serial infidelity, he clearly had some true loves.
There are several women who stand out in his life, and it's almost directly proportional to how often they appear in his art. The two most famous examples are Marie-Thérèse Walter, the beautiful, curvilinear, voluptuous blonde that he met in 1927 when she was 17 and he was 45. And then she was replaced by Dora Maar, who was always depicted in a much more brittle, geometric, hard-edged kind of way.
For each different woman, there is a different Picasso. Jacqueline, at some moment, looked like Fernande, just like the circle was closed. He came back to the first lady through the last one. They are all very different, and all the relations are different.
Picasso's relationships with women were often volatile, and with his children, problematic.
On the one hand, often when they were born, he saw them as solidifying his relationships with the women he loved. He was always urging Françoise Gillot, the mother of Claude and Paloma, to have more children as a way of sort of keeping her from leaving him, which she eventually did, sort of tying her to the home domestic nest. But at the same time, once Picasso's children were born and matured and became young adults and became perhaps less passive and more aggressive or more open, he often sort of started to pull away, and this often coincided with his moving on to a new woman in his life.
The artist was drawn to tension and conflict, which likely contributed to the depiction of human wreckage in many of his paintings.
Death was something that Picasso had a truly superstitious fear of. This perhaps is part of his Spanish heritage. He often said that himself. And I think his aversion to death led him indeed to avoid close, intimate relationships with a lot of the women in his life.
Picasso lived a full and rich life, dying in 1973 at the age of 91. And he was that rare artist who had a great late period in life.
He was now wrestling with the great old masters of time. He was an old master himself now, and he was starting to think about his legacy. He has a serious operation in 1965, and he complained to friends that he said, all the old urges are still there, physical, intellectual, emotional, but I can't act on all of them. But of course he did through his work. He was able to be young again through these great paintings.
Picasso, Life, Work, and Legacy. We'll be right back.
An extraordinary artist in the truest sense of the word, Picasso's genius extended far beyond the canvas as he produced exceptional work in other art forms.
I think that's one of the points of genius in an artist like Picasso, is his ability to work in many medium, not only in oil on canvas, but also in sculpture, particularly metal sculpture, and particularly with found artists in a sort of surrealistic period of time. Also his ability as a draftsman and a printmaker.
It's so difficult to be an artist after Picasso because he created so many. You have things everywhere. In his work you have quite everything.
Many of Picasso's paintings are among the most sought after and the most valuable in the world. His works sell for staggering sums of money.
Despite the fact that Picasso was a rather prolific artist and usually there's always something on the market, his works are so incredibly desirable.
The art lover's appetite for Picasso is insatiable, and now you can see his masterpieces at the De Young Museum in San Francisco, now through October 9th.
This is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for our visitors here to the De Young, because they're going to meet and greet 150 works of art by Picasso. The paintings, the sculpture, the drawings come to us from the Musée Picasso in Paris, which is undergoing an extensive renovation and restoration.
That would be a very fresh moment, just to see the paintings in a different museum, really on the other side of the world. And that will be also a moment of enthusiasm, to think that art belongs to everyone, that art can travel, and that art coming from France is in San Francisco.
These are the works he kept for himself and kept close to him. When he moved throughout his life, he carried this extraordinary collection with him. He said, "I am the greatest collector of Picassos in the world."
We have some iconic examples of works that portray Picasso's first wife, the Russian ballerina. We have the great sculpture called The Head of Fernand. We have an entire gallery full of images of Marie-Thérèse Walter. We also have works from his relationship with the surrealist artist Dora Maar, who was about as equally tough as Picasso.
One of my favorite works in the exhibition is The Head of a Bull. What's fascinating to me about it is Picasso is living as a Spanish exile in Paris under the Nazis, and he uses a bicycle to make the great national symbol of Spain and himself, the bull. I find this interesting because gasoline was in short supply in Paris under the German occupation. It was all going for the war effort. Parisians were therefore compelled to use bicycles to get everywhere. And so were, by the way, the resistance. Right. And I think this becomes a symbol for Picasso that the bicycle bull itself is a form of resistance to the Nazis.
At the time of his death, Picasso actually owned many of his own paintings. He sold very few because he hated letting go of his work. Most of his treasures eventually ended up in the hands of the French government.
The collection was given to the state of France in lieu of death taxes by the Picasso family itself. These were and are Picasso's Picassos.
You have a lot of interesting cities in the world. You have only one San Francisco, so it's perfect to show the masterpieces of the Musée Picasso in Paris, as for the moment they are not available in Paris.
Nearly 40 years after his death, we speak of Picasso as if he's still with us, and indeed he is, as his work continues to captivate audiences and generate spirited debate. And I'm quite certain Picasso will fascinate us for countless centuries to come. Thanks for being with us. I'm Spencer Christian.